What's up, model makers? It's another fine fall afternoon out here at the Rube Goldberg shop, and I thought it would be a good time to take another look at the Tamiya 112th Honda Repsol MotoGP bike kit that I've been working on for Kitmaker Network. So, without any further jaw flapping on my part, let's take a look at where I'm at. Okay, here we go. So, as you can see, I've got a collection of little sub-assemblies here. I think if you remember where I left off last time, I had all the body work done and all the body pieces primed, and they are still sitting over here on the side of the bench exactly like they were that day. Same thing with the engine. I haven't done anything more with it. It's done and ready to go into the swing arm. But not the swing arm, the frame. But what I did have to do was kind of wrap up some detail painting on the frame in order to get ready for that. This plastic guard here that's on the side, as well as the details of the rear brake master cylinder and its plastic guard. I got that done. I also, it's pretty subtle and difficult to see, I also brush painted these mounting brackets with some Vallejo metal colored Duralumin, just to give them a slightly different shade than the rest of the frame, because on the real bike those parts are machined and they just have a slightly different look to them. I also used some Tamiya black panel line washes in there to pick out some of those details. I elected to not go ahead and install the engine because what I want to do is basically get all these sub-assemblies ready so that I can just basically work all the way through putting the major sub-assemblies together right up to the point where I've got the rear wheel on the bike, and that's probably where this video segment will finish up. So in the interest of moving towards that, I also have the swing arm, which as you can see I painted in the same zero metallic silver that I painted the frame with. It's a pretty good approximation of aluminum, and that's when things got a little bit more difficult. This piece right here is really kind of a pain in the ass. As you can see, it's got these sections that are black, actually 80% black, 20% white in this case, because they are all essentially rubber and plastic sliders. This is where the chain loops over the swing arm, and that thing is called the chain buffer, and that just basically keeps the chain from rattling against the swing arm itself. And then these other pieces down here on the bottom. And those all had to be masked off, and as you can imagine, they were kind of a hassle. Tamiya does a good job of giving you a good mold line on most of them so that you can get a good color separation. But it's still pretty difficult, and I wasn't totally happy with it. So what I ended up doing to clean that up, that did give me a pretty happy result, was instead of going around them with a wash, because they were all really accessible and had a nice enough edge to work against, I used one of my Micron Archival Ink black pens. This is the 0.2 millimeter, and it makes a nice crisp hard black line, which does a good job of creating a nice hard edge there and a nice sort of shadow, and helps clean up any sort of little issues that you might have once you peel up the masking. I masked most of this stuff off with liquid masking fluid and Tamiya tape. So there were a few places where I had some less than some perfect edges, but overall I'm pretty happy with it now. It at least looks the part from a distance. One thing that's kind of weird, you may say, is why is the Bridgestone sticker on the opposite side at a different angle? That's because the exhaust pipe comes up here like this, and they want that logo to show more, so they have it at just a little bit of a different angle. Okay, the next part of the swing arm is the rear fender, and you can see it's nice and black, and this actually is just been painted with nothing more than the Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. Now, you may say, but wait, you're not supposed to ever paint parts black. And I say, well, yes and no. I mean, that's one of those rules that I think is meant to be broken at certain times. While I would agree that many times you want a less than black finish, like on things like these rubber sliders, for example, sometimes things really are black or pretty damn close to it. I mean, let's take a look at the bottle cap on this Mr. Paint bottle. That is about as black as you're going to get. And what happens a lot of times is that with different finishes, different materials, you get different sort of reflectivity, different level of sheen from different things that are all supposed to be black, and so they may look a little more or less black. But sometimes you need things that just actually are pretty black, especially on a modern vehicle that's shiny and clean. So that's why I've elected to go ahead and make the fenders a hard black. Also because in real life they have a kind of a semi-gloss finish, and the natural satin of the Mr. Surfacer I think looks really nice there, and it'll set off well against the aluminum finish of the swing arm. So that's done. The next thing that I had moved on to was the pipes, and I actually did a video review that included these, because I painted these using the Mr. Paint metallics, and specifically the hot metal colors and the titanium colors, which I really like. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about them or what I did with those paints, but suffice it to say that they work really good. They're very similar to all clad. They don't need to be thinned. They are lacquers. And they come in most, if not all, of the same or more shades than all clad does. And definitely feel like that they're a good addition to my arsenal of paints. They're hot metal colors, which they have violet, blue, pale burnt metal, and a couple of others. Really work good for these pipes. In real life, these pipes are titanium, and they get a lot of really interesting heat staining right from the get-go. Even when they're just being fabricated, the welding a lot of times creates some of these blue discolorations. But as the pipes go through stages of heat aging, they definitely get more and more interesting, and they go through phases of where they go from their normal sort of raw gray brown titanium color to a darker brown, and then to a kind of a purple, and finally to this nice deep blue. So it's cool. It's a lot of fun, and I feel like they like the result was pretty well worth it. What I did is I started out on these. I painted the whole thing with the titanium silver, then came back with the hot metal violet for some of those joints where the metal was a little thicker. And then came back with the hot metal blue, did some shading, but left open some areas that were not as heated. And I also had to do a lot of masking because, as you can see, this section right here, what happens with that in real life is it's made out of, instead of one continuous piece of tubing that's been bent to shape, it's made out of sections of tubing that are cut to angles and then welded together. And so what I did is I used the real skinny Izu masking tape to mask that off before I sprayed the hot metal blue to create the appearance of those weld beads. And that's, I think, a pretty good approximation. Then once I had all that shading done, I was fairly happy with it. They looked pretty good, but I was showing them to guys on Scale Modelers Critique Group, and Mike Rinaldi popped up and said, well, that's good. That's a good start, but what are you going to do for the next step? And of course I knew what he meant, which was get busy with some oil paint rendering. And after I rested up from all the hard labor of masking and painting, I decided to go ahead and do exactly that. I already had a layer of satin varnish on them, which I made by just mixing half and half Tester's clear gloss lacquer with Tester's dull coat, and then thinning it with Mr. Leveling Thinner. So that was the perfect base to do a little bit of oil paint rendering on. And so I finally found a use for the blue tubes that are in my Winsor & Newton set and just came in and did a little bit of work here and there to create a little bit of splotchiness. You can see kind of there on the backs of those pipes, and just introduce even more sort of variety into those stains. And if you look at pictures of these online, you can see that happens. They kind of start out by getting a real smoothly graduated coloration to them, but because of oil and different things that collect on the pipes when they're hot, they then start to get some of these splotchier color patches as the heat distribution is affected. So anyway, pretty cool stuff. I'm happy with the way they came out. I went ahead and put another coat of satin on them after I did the oil because that left a real matte finish in certain areas, and I wanted a kind of a metallic sheen, so came back over that with another coat of the satin, and that's where they'll be when they go on. Now, having said all that, in a way, this was kind of just for practice, because the truth is, these pipes are almost 100% hidden by the bodywork. In fact, all of those welds there that I worked so hard to mask off and paint are pretty much going to be hidden. So, in a way, this was just a little bit of experience building, but hey, it's all good. Okay, the next thing was to tackle the chain and sprocket set, which, as is pretty typical with these Tamiya motorcycle kits, is all one piece, but very well molded, as you can see. And it's a good thing, because these things present a lot of painting challenge if you really want to produce something that looks realistic. It gets pretty deep. Just to kind of walk you through what I did here. Basically, I started out by priming it with Mr. Surfacer 1500. Then I sprayed the center section of the hub there with Mr. Paint Titanium Silver. Then I came back and very carefully sprayed this front sprocket and the outside edge of the chain with the Vallejo Metal Color Gunmetal Gray, because that gives you a nice approximation of oil hardened high carbon steel, which is typically what these kind of sprockets and these chain rollers are made of. Once I had that, I came in with some liquid masking fluid and masked off the hub there. And then just very carefully, so that I wouldn't get any overspray on this edge or anything. I also masked this front sprocket. I then came in with some all-clad gold titanium, which is this right here. Now, why I switched over to the all-clad for that step was because Mr. Paint just didn't have a good gold titanium that I liked. And so I got that specifically because I knew the chain was going to need a shade like that. So once I had the chain painted, then I came back in and masked. Actually, I got out of order. Before I painted the chain, I painted the sprocket with Mr. Paint Exhaust Metallic. And the reason I chose that shade is because in real life, that sprocket is aluminum, but it's hard anodized, and it has a kind of a brownish black finish to it, what I would kind of equate to like black coffee almost. But it still has a kind of a metallic sheen, so I felt like that exhaust metal was a good color for that. So then, once I had that painted, then I masked off the rest of the sprocket, and then I painted the titanium gold on both sides of the chain. Once I had all of that finished, then I removed all the masking fluid, and this was a situation where masking fluid worked pretty well. The part creates natural edges, and it lets you get a really thin layer of masking fluid in there, which I do with a toothpick. And so it works pretty well. I also paint real lightly so that it doesn't build up on the masking fluid and cause any chips when I pull that away. But anyway, it turned out pretty good. I had a nice clean mask, didn't have to do any touch-ups, so I was pretty happy about that. Then I came in and it was time to paint all of the heads of the individual pins. And what I chose to do with that was, rather than paint, I actually just used a Sharpie, which is really nice because the tip of a Sharpie is kind of hard. And so it makes it real easy, especially since these are nice and crisply molded. It makes it real easy to get just a little bit of ink only on the head of that pin and leave it as kind of a semi-black, which it is in real life. And so I got those nice and crisp. Then I came in with Tamiya panel line wash and just very carefully put some of that in between each link plate so that the inner links, which are a darker steel color, would show up that way. And then, almost done, I promise. Then I came back and painted the heads of the bolts and these nuts with just some Vallejo metal color aluminum as a base for some Tamiya clear blue to give them the blue anodized look that the actual parts do in real life. So you can sort those out from that hair on the back of my hand. You can kind of see the effect. I had to come back and touch up the actual bolt heads with a little bit more silver, but overall, you know, I'm pretty happy with the way this turned out. I didn't have a lot of touch-up to do because, again, Tamiya does a really good job with these parts of molding everything super, super crisp so that you get a good separation between colors because of how the paint naturally wants to flow. What I find with these kind of things is that part of what helps me is keeping the paint as thin as possible and just having a tiny bit on the tip of the brush and just basically letting the paint go where it wants to as opposed to trying to force it in. So here's just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. Let me get a pointer here and I'll use this wheel, which is, as you can see, already painted up with this nice color orange. Anyway, let's say that this was a tiny little bolt head and I was trying to paint it silver. So what I would do, instead of coming in with my brush loaded with silver paint and trying to brush clear down here next to this, say that this was the flange right here, rather than coming in and trying to paint right down to the flange, what I would do is have just enough paint loaded into the brush that when I touch right here, that it flows down and naturally stops in that corner. So I don't have to worry about whether or not the brush is really small enough to paint a clean line right there, or that my hand is steady enough, or that I can see well enough, because the truth is none of those things are true. I'm a total barbarian with a paintbrush. But rather I let the paint do its work naturally. And that's a sort of a little secret that I've learned over time that definitely helps me get better color separations on this kind of detail painting. Now, speaking of this rear wheel, you can see that it is nice and orange, and it is in fact the fluorescent orange from the Zero paint set. And what I opted to do in this case, this is not something that I do a whole lot because I'm a big proponent of using primer. But this was a pretty compelling case for not using any. Also, it's the one time when I'm happy that the parts were molded in white plastic, because you need a white base coat underneath this fluorescent orange in order for it to pop the way that it's supposed to. Now, being that it's a lacquer, I knew that it would stick immediately to the plastic, and that I really didn't have to have a primer for that reason. I knew I wasn't going to be doing any finishing work on these wheels. There is a little bit of a mold seam in there, but I just decided I wasn't going to worry about it. And so basically there was no reason not to just go directly onto the plastic with the fluorescent orange, which really the camera, I can tell, is not going to do it justice at just how bright and pretty it is. But it is pretty cool. I will say this, I wish the Zero paint was a little thicker, because it literally took about 6 layers of buildup to get to where it had the density that I wanted. And the good news, I guess, is that this is probably the part where I'll use the most paint on this entire project as far as the orange goes. But you can see this bottle was full up to just below the threads here when I started, and you can see how much of it I used just to paint that rear wheel. So it took quite a while to get it done, but I think it looks pretty good. I may go on there with a coat of semi-gloss lacquer or satin lacquer. I haven't decided yet. The real wheels are not super glossy, but they're also not quite as flat as this is, so I don't know. Haven't decided yet. But the next step for the wheel is to get the tire mounted, and then there's a couple of decals that go on the edges of the rim and then of course on the tire itself. I also will be at that point mounting the rear disc brake, or the rear disc and the caliper and all that, and that's something worth talking about. This is the rear disc rotor, and as you can see, I've got it clamped in this vise, and that's for 2 reasons. One is because I decided to go ahead and drill out all of those holes. Even though they were well molded, they're just no substitute for having a hole that goes all the way through. Even if I had used some wash in there. And part of the reason that I wanted to do that was because I knew that I would not be able to use a wash on the disc itself, for the simple reason that the disc is coated in the wonderful Ushi van der Rosten metallic powder, which I've done a video review on before, but you can see it's this stuff right here. This stuff is fantastic. If I can get this open real quick, I'll show you. You can see what it looks like. It's just this powder. It's a lot like a pigment, but it has something in it that makes it stick and makes it easy to polish. And I have never found anything yet that gives a more lifelike metallic finish. There's 3 of them you can get: a chrome, an aluminum, and then this steel, which I felt like was the right choice for this brake rotor. And you can see, hopefully the camera will do it justice, but you can see it's got a nice metallic sheen to it. What I've found is the best for these metallic powders is to not have a mirror gloss before you apply it, but to have just a light scuff like you get from, say, 1000 grit sanding paper. And so that's what I did. After I painted the center of the disc carrier with Mr. Paint Titanium Silver, I had a little bit of overspray. So I just polished the outside edge of the disc a little bit with a polishing stick and made that nice and smooth, and then that powder went on really well. The way you apply that is simple. You just use a Q-tip and you just start rubbing it in there, and you can see how shiny and nice it comes up. I've also got a video I think I mentioned on the powders, and you can see in there how they work and how they're applied. Now, what I had said about not being able to use a wash is because these powders will come right off of there if they come in contact with mineral spirits. So obviously, using a wash to darken those individual holes was not going to be an option, given that I wanted to use the powders. So, at any rate, I think for all those reasons that drilling those out was the right thing to do, even though it was a little bit of a hassle. Okay, last but certainly not least, because it is definitely one of my favorite things, is the rear damper, the shock, and the associated detail up parts from Tamiya. As you can see, it's just super cool. The detail up parts include the spring, which is already that nice yellow as it should be, and then the valve body here in the middle where the nitrogen reservoir attaches, and that nitrogen reservoir is machined in aluminum and anodized in gold, just like it is on the real O-Lens damper. And then of course you get the O-Lens stickers or decals with the Tamiya stuff. So I just think that's super cool. Like I did on the bolts for the rear sprocket, I came in with the Tamiya clear blue and then some MIG crystal red to give the high and low speed compression adjusting knobs a nice anodized red and blue look. I also, don't want to forget this, I also wrapped the shock shaft with bare metal chrome foil to give it a more realistic appearance. So this little bit was kind of a hassle because there were 3 different colors of metal that I wanted to use, plus the bolt heads. So a lot of little detail painting bits there, but definitely felt like it was worth the effort to do all those. So I've got a nice little bit of parts that are almost ready to assemble here. And so the next clip, hopefully we will see all of this stuff combined with the engine into about half of a rolling chassis. Okay, so I just finished a pretty delicate operation and I thought it was worth talking about. And that is the placement of the tire decals. Now, these things are different from regular decals in that they are on this backing paper and they've got this protective sheet over them, which the basic instructions are that you remove the protective sheet, you put a little water on the surface of where you're going to apply it to, then take the decal with still attached to this paper and put it in position and rub the back of it with wet fingertip or a Q-tip and put a little pressure on it until the decal is stuck to the surface and the blue paper or the white paper, whatever you want to call it, comes away. Now, there's 2 major problems with that, both involving the fact that you can't see through that backing paper. First of all is getting it positioned correctly. Unless you cut right around the profile of the lettering, you're going to have a hard time getting it exactly in the right spot on the arc of the tire and correctly spaced sort of halfway between the edge of the sidewall and the edge of the rim. And you don't get a lot of working time, so that's a problem. The other problem is that because the paper is not transparent, you can't tell when the decal comes loose from it. So this is a problem. So what I did is I got a little brave and just tried a different technique, sort of based on my past experience with similar tire decals. What I did is I just put a little puddle of water right here on the bench, and I had these individual decals cut out separately. So I just put the decal into the puddle of water facing up after I've removed the protective film, obviously. And then within probably 30 seconds or a minute, I'm able to use these very sharp pointed tweezers to pick up the edge of the transfer and lift it off of the backing paper. And it, it'll come off pretty easily and it's not going to fall apart on you. At least assuming everything is normal. And so then you've got it in your tweezers, and the next thing is to flip it over and lay it down in the right position on the tire. And the key there is to keep it floating until it's in the right spot. So what I do is I just take some water, just like this, and with my fingertip, I just make a sort of a puddle of water there that I then lay the transfer onto. And what you do is you just you hold it by one end with the tweezers, and you kind of drag it until the correct side is facing down, and then just drag it into position as close as you can and sort of drop it on the puddle of water. Then, because it's floating, you can move it around with the tip of your hobby knife or whatever. And once it's in the right spot, then you take a Q-tip and you start working at one end of it and just press down and blot the water off of it and get it where it's stuck into position. And at that point, you're committed. So you just have to be, paying attention to what you're doing and make sure it's actually in the place that you want it to be before you start to do that last step, because it isn't moving after that. Now, one thing I've noticed is that you will get little places on the edge where the carrier film, which is clear just like with normal decals, will kind of show because it's not really settling perfectly. And you can kind of see that if you look sort of at the edge of the Bridgestone sticker there. Not a big deal. This is a decal, and so what I've done to help minimize that is the same thing I would do with any other little bitty decal like this. And that is get some of my favorite decal hammer, which is Solvaset, and a little tiny brush like this, and just put a tiny bit of Solvaset on the brush and just work it. I don't actually have any on here, I'm just demonstrating, but just work it along the edge of the decal or in any place where it looks like it's not all the way down. Same thing with these little bitty decals on the rim. Just take this little tiny brush loaded with Solvaset and just very lightly brush a layer of it over them, and they will be welded on there perfectly. Now, one thing that I don't like about these tire decals is that they are a little bit shiny. And so what I have done in the past, and may do on this one, is I'll take just a little bit of my Model Master Acryl, which is a water-based acrylic clear matte varnish. And again, using a tiny little brush, just brush a real thin layer of that over the decal, and that way it'll kind of take the sheen off of it without spreading all around to the rest of the tire. So anyway, I'm not sure that's exactly the best procedure to use with these, but it has proven to be pretty effective for me. Okay, so it's amazing how quickly things can go from going pretty well to total disaster in the model making world. So that's what's happened, and let me explain. If you look here at the instructions, what you'll see is that when you install the engine, you slip it into the cradle, and then for these front motor mounts, they want you to use these 1.2 millimeter by 2.5 millimeter long screws. No big deal. That's pretty normal for Tamiya. They give you the screws, they give you the little screwdriver to do it. Anybody that's ever built a Tamiya kit is, that's got these screws is familiar with this. Now, here in the back part of the engine mount, they want you to use these 4 millimeter long black screws. Now, what you end up with is this right here. You can see it if you look closely in this photo. Right there, you can see the Phillips screw head for the lower motor mount. Now, On the real thing, what that actually is obviously not a 1-inch diameter Phillips head screw. It's actually a bolt head. And I'll talk more about that here in a second. Here is what happened to me. Yeah, things are obviously not supposed to look like that. So what happened? I put the motor in the cradle and it fit in there just as nice and tight as you'd expect. I put the front screws in and got the back screws started. And they very quickly became unmanageable, at least at my level of dexterity, with the little standard issue Tamiya screwdriver. So I switched over to this handy dandy little thing that I've got, which is a super cool little motorized screwdriver that I have used in the past for this kind of thing. And as you can see, it's got a nice sharp Phillips bit in it, as you would want, to make sure that you don't strip out the head of your tiny Phillips screw. I was able to screw the front screws all the way in without too much difficulty. Unfortunately, the other screws only went in about halfway before they seized up. Just too much friction. And I worked and worked and worked at it. I had this thing basically sandwiched in a death grip, using a rag to make sure that I didn't rub any paint off or damage anything. In spite of all those efforts, I managed to break this little mounting bracket off right here. And all of that effort was to no avail. There was basically a point where the screws just would not go in anymore. And as a result, I did something that I've literally done probably less than half a dozen times in 30 years of turning wrenches, which was strip the screw heads out. So needless to say, I was furious about that, and if this were not a Kitmaker Network project video, I would be using some four-letter words to describe the situation. So what to do? I was, in a bind because I've got this black screw sticking about 2 millimeters out of the frame on one side and about half that much on the other side. So there really was no choice. I couldn't get them to go in. I couldn't get them to come out. And obviously they were going to show up, badly on the finished product. So I had to resort to my Proxon and an abrasive wheel to grind them down to the surface. And obviously I didn't do that perfectly. The good news is that's a fairly easy paint fix. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill that, sand it smooth, paint it back over, and then take and punch out some little discs with my punch and die set and put them on there and paint them black to represent like a black rubber plug that you might find in a place like that. I think it'll be believable, and here's the thing. It will certainly be much more believable than a giant out-of-scale Phillips screw head. And this is the thing that really annoys me about this situation. I mean, it's bad enough that you've got a superfine thread screw that doesn't cut its own threads in plastic, and that you're trying to screw in there, and a hole that's obviously a bit too tight, because that's all secondary. The real issue here is, why did Tamiya choose to give you the screw at all, when in fact on the real thing it's nothing like that? And they could have done like they've done in some of their other motorcycle kits and give you a false bolt head molded, on the sprue that you basically could have just inserted in there with a little bit of extra thin. It would have been more than strong enough. There's no real load on this thing. There's no reason why you have to have a 4 millimeter long metal screw in there, especially given that 2.5 millimeter screw is long enough for the other motor mounts and you're going through the same amount of material in the lower frame there as you are in the upper frame. So all the way around, you know, it's a bad decision on Tamiya's part to make you put the screws in, and they compounded that by giving you these ridiculous 4mm screws instead of the shorter ones. Just really a head scratcher. Now, it is what it is, it's done, and if you find yourself in this situation where you're building this kit, let me give you what I think are 3 recommendations for how you can get around finding yourself in the absurd position that I did. The first is, if you want to use the screw and you want to screw it in, take these engine case parts and thread those screws in there before you do any assembly or any painting. That way, when you put the engine in the cradle, you know that you've already got some threads and the screws should just walk right in there. And if you have a problem, it'll be much simpler and easier to fix than this situation. That's option number 1. Option number 2 is to just go in there with a 1.2mm drill bit and ream out the holes in the engine casing before you do any of the assembly, so that the screws basically just slide in there. You could put a little drop of glue in there to make sure, but trust me, just having those slid in there as pins would be plenty strong enough and would ensure that you wouldn't have to mess with trying to thread them in. Now, the third option, and this is what I would do if I find myself in this situation again, is to throw those little screws, for these 2 little screws anyway, as far away as possible, and insert a short piece of plastic rod into the hole through the frame to provide you with the strength, and then just punch out a small disc of styrene to act as a false bolt head that you can then basically just drop into that socket and glue in place, and then paint appropriately. So that then not only have you not messed with the silly screw situation, but you have a much more realistic looking result, you know, that's going to show much better right there in that area of the finished product. So anyway, that is about all I should say about that, because even as I'm recounting all of this, I find my blood pressure rising and I'm on the verge of saying things I probably should not. So let's move on. Okay, so after some wrestling, I finally have gotten to the sort of stopping place that I was trying to get to, which was having the back end of the rolling chassis assembled and the engine in the cradle and so forth. But first, a little house cleaning. Where to start? Let me tell you about this disc, because I feel like I got to point out a mistake that I made. I'm not sure if I mentioned this or not, but I think I talked about having drilled out all of these holes in the rear rotor. The reason I did that is because I've only ever seen them with holes all the way through. And Tamiya, for whatever reason, at least that's what I thought at the time, had only molded them as pockets. I didn't find out until later, after I'd already drilled all 30 or so of those holes, and I was researching the color of the rear caliper, that I discovered that the Honda disc does in fact have pockets and not holes, or at least on the current MotoGP bike. So I don't know why they choose to only have the holes go like halfway through the disc, but that apparently was correctly molded on Tamiya's part. So anyway, a mistake on my part, but no big deal. I think it actually makes it look a little more interesting, and you know, who's to say that they never did use rotors that were fully drilled, because this is race team stuff and it changes all the time. Which also sort of applies to a mistake that I've made with the color of the rocker arm under the shock. That's really supposed to be more of a brownish red anodizing. The Tamiya instructions call for this kind of pale gold or goldish aluminum, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. Like I said, that stuff changes all the time. Now, for the most major bit, as you can see, I've sort of done the rescue and cleanup of the situation here with these screws. Now, what I have decided has happened is that I screwed up, literally, because, as you'll see here, what it calls for on the swing arm, rather the engine, are these 4mm long black screws. Then over here, where you assemble the linkage to the swing arm, you can see that you need 6mm long black screws. And I think basically that I grabbed the long ones to somehow manage to grab both of the 6mm ones for the motor mount, and that's why they bottomed out and wouldn't go in any further. I still hold to my position that they shouldn't have been screws in the first place, though. And I guess all that ends, all is well that ends well, because while the situation forced me into doing something silly here with these little black round discs, it still looks the part, and it did force me into thinking overall about how I was going to hide bolt heads or screw heads, because Tamiya gives you these Phillips screws for a couple of other things, one of which is the swing arm pivot bolt. And they give you a little plastic piece to glue over the top of the screw, but it doesn't look actually like a bolt head. Same thing with the rear axle. So what I did is I ditched the screws altogether. I replaced this pivot with a piece of 1.4mm brass tubing, and then, because I happen to have some little bitty bolts from Scale Hardware laying around, which if you've never looked at Scale Hardware, check them out. They are the go-to place for really cool tiny metal hardware. Anyway, I had some of their stuff laying around for another project. So once I had, what I did is I cut the brass tubing to be long enough to just go through the pivot to the bottom of this pocket right here. And then I chopped the head off that little bolt and then glued it in place over the end of that. So I've got a nice metal bolt head. Same thing on the rear axle, except I used 1.6mm tubing. I had to ream the hole on the opposite side for that, but that was no big deal. I have a 2mm screw or bolt head on here, which hopefully you can see, which really does look the part. Now, it's not exactly accurate, because even though that is literally like a 32mm or 35mm fastener on the real thing, it's actually a nut on the end of the axle, because what happens is on the opposite end of the axle, it's basically got a square head on it so that it's trapped and doesn't turn when you're loosening or tightening the nut that's on this side. So the ideal thing would have been for me to take one of these bolts and then a nut, a 1.2mm nut, take and cut the shaft of the bolt off, screw the nut partway down on it, and then glue that in place to show basically the giant axle nut. But I don't have any of those, any nuts that size. So anyway, no big deal. I think it really looks the part. It's nice. It's nice and steel colored like the real thing, and it is just about the right size. So I think that works good. I think I'm also going to go ahead and pursue the same strategy on these two fasteners, where one of the exhaust pipes and the exhaust pipe cover attached to the frame, because those are also the little 1.2mm Phillips head screws. And I think I've got some hardware I can replace those with that will look pretty cool. So that's basically pretty much everything in a nutshell. I think I talked about the fact that I finished the rear disc in Ushi van der Rosten metal powder, which came out pretty good. I think I had said I was going to do a semi-gloss or a satin finish on the rear wheel. I ended up wanting it to be a little shinier than that. So what it is it's actually just Tamiya X22 clear thinned 50/50 with Mr. Leveling Thinner, which makes for a really nice semi-gloss finish. It's not super shiny, but not as dull as what I was going to do if I had mixed clear gloss lacquer and clear matte lacquer. So at any rate, I think this is pretty well wrapped up to this point, and I can finally set it aside and work on some other stuff for a while. Okay, I know I said that was going to be the last clip, but since I was talking about replacing some of the bolt heads, I thought it would be worth a couple of minutes to just go ahead and show you that. As you can see, I've installed some of the plastic guards, and the pipe guard in particular, and the radiator is now on. But the important thing here are these bolt heads. You can see those two there, and what I've done is I basically just used a little short piece of 35 thousandths styrene rod planted in the hole on the mounting bracket, and used that to hang both the pipe and the cover off of. And then I took my little aluminum bolt heads, which I'll show you here in a second, and just snipped the shaft off of them and super glued them in place on top of the hole. So I think it creates a pretty nice effect. A little bit large, but they definitely look the part. While I was at it, I also went ahead and removed the molded in detail at the back end of the swing arm there for the chain adjusters, because what those normally have is a screw that passes through that chain adjuster and butts up against the end of the swing arm, and turning that screw in and out is what moves the rear wheel backwards or forwards to tension the chain. And the molded in detail was just goofy, so I felt like it was worthwhile to put some bolt heads there. They definitely look the part more effectively than what was there. Although I would definitely not recommend doing an operation like that after something like this has already been painted and assembled. That just gets silly. But hey, all's well that ends well, and pretty much now definitely at the point where I can move on to the front end of this thing. I almost forgot to show you the actual hardware. So here you go. These are the little bolt heads that I used. You can get hopefully a good look at those. You can see that they are pretty tiny. These, I believe, have a 50 thousandths hex head on top of them. They come in other sizes from the fine folks at RB Motion. They've even got, as you can see, these little acorn nuts for things like cylinder heads, and they're just super cool. This package has got some slightly larger bolt heads. You can see there. They're just damn cool. Okay, so there you go. That obviously ended up being a little longer and a little more drama-filled than I planned when I was thinking about this segment of the video for the project. But hey, you know what? That's the way model making goes sometimes. You get yourself into these situations, and I think a big part of developing skills is in how we get ourselves out of said situations. So, and I have plenty of practice at that. That's got a lot to do with why I chose Rube Goldberg as my screen name for this stuff. Anyway, so enough rambling. I hope you enjoyed it, a drama and all, and found it useful if you plan to build this kit, which I still believe is very cool. I wish Tamiya would do something different besides these silly little screws, but hey, as you can see, I found a solution that looks pretty cool. So there it is. Stay tuned for the next episode where we will get into the front end of this little moto monster. All right, guys, as always, I really appreciate you watching. Take care. Much love.